Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good morning. Thank you all very much for being here and for travelling over. If you've had been travelling this morning or yesterday, we're very grateful to you for coming to give evidence this morning as part of our inquiry on the UK's economic relationship with the European Union. Just for the benefit, we have people watching online as well as those who are in the room. I'm just going to ask you all to introduce yourselves. Mr. Kearns.
Ibrahim Kunz, I'm the CEO of the Port of Zeebrugge.
Thank you.
I'm John Keefe. I'm Director of Public Affairs for GetLink, the owner of Eurotunnel.
Thank you.
And I'm Benoît Rochet, Deputy CEO of the Port of Calais.
Lovely. Well, thank you all, as I say, very much indeed. And I wanted perhaps just a broad opening question to all three of you. If you could give the committee an idea of the scale of movement of cargo between your ports and obviously Eurotunnel and the UK, and an approximate idea of the economic value of that trade. I'm sure those are figures that you've already covered, perhaps in evidence, but it's very helpful to hear from you orally. Mr. Rochet, perhaps we can start with you.
So, Port of Calais has two major clients. We've got lorry drivers and we've got tourists. I think the most important clients here are our drivers. So, every year, or in 2017, 2 million lorries crossed the channel via Calais. So 1 million on the way and 1 million the other way, because the figures are almost symmetrical. So it's an important number of lorries. On the whole Dover Strait, so including GetLink, there are about 4.6 million lorries a year. So about 2/3 of the traffic crosses the channel via the Dover Strait. So Calais, Dunkerque and the tunnel.
And what value is that, roughly?
Maybe because you've just updated your studies. So you
Mr. Keith, go on, you tell us.
Yesterday?
Yes, published yesterday. Through the Channel Tunnel directly, it's about £138 billion worth of goods every year. If you add if we take that down into pounds, it's somewhere in the region of 120 billion, depending on which exchange rate you use. And the Port of Calais adds about the same amount. So we're talking about £240 billion worth of goods traded between the UK and the EU 27 through the short straits. And the short straits is a particularly important route because that's about 26% of all of the trade that we do between the UK and continental Europe. Most of it is truck-based. Our part of it is 1.6 million in trucks per year. The importance of the route is because of the speed of crossing, the frequency of crossing, and the ease of access to markets. It fits very well with the organisation of the economic model that operates across Europe these days. That is one of just-in-time, often of just-in-sequence. And because a very important part of the trade is postal courier, express delivery, internet retail trade, it's the bit that's becoming known as the just when I need it. So it's going into consumers and it's going into supermarkets and direct distribution centres. And on top of that, then there are about 2.5 million passenger cars going through, and in total about 20 million people, if you combine those that go through the Channel Tunnel on the shuttle services and those that go through on Eurostar to Paris, London, Brussels, and now Amsterdam.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Coons, perhaps you could just give us an idea of the size and scale of the operation at Zeebrugge.
Yeah, the Port of Zeebrugge is a UK port. I mean, 45% of our traffic is linked to the UK, so that's very important for us. In that we have all type of goods, mainly also automotive equipment, chemical products, food products and textiles, which come from our region. Our region is exporting importing and exporting together about 50 million euros of goods to the UK. And what we are for us important is in totally we do 2.8 million cars, out of which 1 million is related, new cars, to the import-export to the UK market. And we have about 70 sailings a week to the UK, which is 10 a day, just delivery is very important. In comparison to the Calais, we have mostly 95% of our goods are unaccompanied freight, meaning that the freight is arriving at the port and then going into the vessel and then continue its traffic in the UK, not with the driver on it.
Right. And you also handle non-EU freight as well.
Yeah, of course, we have a lot of non-EU.
Could you just talk us through the differences in the way that, broadly, again, and time, but between how non-EU and EU freight is handled?
Well, the difference is, of course, the checks, the controls and the papers. But to be frankly, also the non-EU is quite smoothly because it's going to the Far East or wherever. It's already, a lot of that cargo is digitalized, and so we have this paperless terminals, like the Costco terminals, which is the Chinese terminal. They go through that. There are controls on that, which is apparently about 1 to 5% of the physical checks, which is not, of course, the case for the UK cargo, which passes through within the custom units for the moment. And that if we would have checks with all this, that would create, of course, an amount. We have about 4,000 trucks a day. And that would be, if you align them, that would be about 80 kilometers a line, and quite some hectares to store them. But we are not expecting, of course, every truckload or container load to be checked. We would suppose that it would be the similar as for the non-EU traffic now.
Thank you. It's very helpful. And talking about trucks and delays, what work has the Port of Calais done in terms of if there were to be checks on lorries and drivers on your side, how quickly would it take for things to slow down?
So the first thing is just to remind that if our clients come to the Dover Strait, it's because it corresponds to what they need. Because John Keefe talked about the just-in-time logistics. So the main asset of the Dover Strait is the speed, obviously, the crossing, the flexibility, and the frequency. Because in Zeebrugge, you said you had 70 crossing a week. Yes. We have 50 crossing a day. So it's not the same kind of number. Yeah, but it's shorter. Obviously, it's shorter. And we have very few controls, except controls done by the UKBF and the port about the migrants issue. But today there are very few custom checks, and there is no sanitary inspection. Tomorrow, if the United Kingdom becomes a third party, there will have to be controls on goods. The main issue would not be goods going to the United Kingdom from the European Union, because you would be in charge to do this control, proceed this control in the United Kingdom. But I'd say the main issue would be to carry out controls on lorries coming from Dover. French customs told us that, and it's almost the same figure as when you said, the physical control would be about 1%. So if a ferry can carry about 100 lorries, it means that on this particular ferry there would just be one lorry controlled per crossing, so it's not a very big deal. But most important is the sanitary inspection, because if there is no particular deal between the European Union and the United Kingdom, then there will be very frequent controls of all the lorries containing or transporting meat or fishes and I don't know what. So that could be a problem.
So that exactly. So the sanitary
Yes.
checks are perhaps of more concern to you than the customs checks.
Yeah, yes, but we have to implement a system, or we have to give the customs all the information they need in order to select, to target the right lorry they want to control.
Now, before I hand over to the MP from Dover, who I know is going to have lots of questions on this inevitably,
I know, yeah.
just the last question is just about the Common Transit Convention and how important is that for all of your businesses, and what discussions, if any, have you had about the UK's continued membership of the convention? Mr. O'Shea.
It's important to us because, as Joachim said, we have in Calais about 5% of our traffic which is unaccompanied trailers. So drivers come, they let the trailer in a car park in the port, and then the port handles it. But more than 95% of the goods are accompanied lorries, which means that you've got the trailer, you've got the tractor, the lorry, and the lorry driver. So we need to be sure that the lorry driver will be allowed to cross. We need to be sure that even if he's a European citizen, he comes from France or Poland, for example, I don't know, and that all his driving licenses and things like that will be he will be allowed to drive with these licenses in the United Kingdom, because then that could be very painful for the traffic.
Okay, that's very important. Common Transit Convention, any other, Mr. Keith?
If we look at the volume of traffic, it's 90% of all of the road-borne traffic that goes through the route. A lot of it is also groupage loading, which means that it's picking up at different points of the journey. So it's not simply origin to destination. It's often making a series of stops. And the ability to make stops in different countries, so to go freely through the whole of the European area, is vitally important. And this in particular with things that are moving quickly, because often the instruction to pick up a load comes during the journey, and so a diversion is made to pick up a load part way through. And the ability to be able to have a driver who is based in one country driving a truck that comes from a third country, picking up, or from a second country, picking up goods in a third country and carrying them onto a fourth or a fifth country is vital in both directions. And it's particularly important to note the circularity of the whole system. People are coming into the UK, dropping off goods, picking up other goods and going back out and dropping them off again at various different destinations. So that whole ability to move freely across all of the countries that we're trading with is vitally important.
Yeah,
would you agree with that?
The smoother can get it, the better. And it's not only in the food products, because, for instance, Honda UK needs 2 million components to build his car here in the UK, and the stock time is only 1 hour. So they need really the just-in-time delivery, and so the smoother it can continue, the better.
Thank you. Charlie.
Thank you. So, the short sea route, it's critical that you get fast turnaround, and has been the case for many years. We're now nearly 2 years on from the referendum on to leave the European Union. What guidance have any of you received from the Treasury or the Home Office on preparation for Brexit from our side of our government side of things?
Mr. O'Shea.
We had several meetings with the port of Dover, but the most important problem is that we know that there's a Brexit, but we don't exactly know what Brexit means.
You're not alone.
So there are several scenarios. Obviously, we're working on several scenarios in order to be prepared for the worst. But today it's a bit hard to see where we will go and at what time we will reach this target. So we work on we work first with Dover, with the HM Customs, but we also work with the French Customs, because it will also be there will be a major actor of this new system, and we have already met also the administration that will be in charge of sanitary inspection, in order first to tell them what the traffic is on the Dover Strait, because Paris is a bit far from the north coast first, and then we work with them in order to see what the best organization could be in order to allow a free flow of the traffic as smooth as possible.
Mr. Keefe, have you heard from the Treasury or the Home Office, had guidance from them?
We've been working with the British government, across government, through the Border Delivery Group in mainly. We've spent an enormous amount of time ensuring that everybody understands how our business works, how important the Channel Tunnel is to the UK economy and to the rest of Europe. We've had a lot of exchange. We have worked on a number of different possible scenarios. We are still waiting, I think, like everybody is, for the clarity of the final agreement, because in order to make our contingency planning, we need to have a direction to go in, and at the moment we are discussing different directions which lead to different solutions, and that means that we can be prepared to follow one of those routes, but we can't actually go any further than that at this stage.
So nearly 2 years on from the referendum, have you had guidance on preparing for the so-called no-deal scenario? Are you clear on what you're to do?
We have had very clear guidance on what might happen in a no-deal scenario, and we're preparing for that as much as we can. The real thing that we're missing is the clear specification, the absolute detailed specification of what inspections might be required, what kind of volume of inspection will be could be introduced, because it's from that specification that we can actually move on to making our own contingency plans.
And let's say the day after the referendum, orders have gone out from the Treasury and the Home Office to immediately prepare for all scenarios and prepare for no deal whatsoever. Would we be in a position, or have been in a position for March next year, to be prepared for every eventuality? Do you think we could have done that?
It all depends on what the requirement is at the time. The specification is where we're at the moment. Once we have that specification, as an industry, we're very flexible. We're adaptable. We work across international borders. That's part of the world we're in. But the important part is knowing which way to invest, and the specification becomes everything.
So the clear specification for Brexit and what's expected of you, you would say we can deliver?
Absolutely.
And what guidance have you had from the Home Office on maintaining border security in all scenarios?
Border security, the Channel Tunnel is amongst the best in the world. We've come a very, very long way in a couple of years. The immigration crisis of 2015, you remember very well. That was a very good example of industry adapting to a changing set of circumstances. So in security terms, we've worked very, very well with the Home Office, with Border Force, and with the authorities in France as well. And we've adapted to that very different situation that we're in. So, and that gives us a great deal of confidence that once we have a clear idea of where we're going in the post-Brexit world, that we'll adapt similarly.
Mr. Cones, we've been having you do a lot of non-EU WTO type business. We've been having a little debate in this country about how much it costs to do customs clearance, whether it is like 10% of the cost, 20 billion, or whether it's more like 1% of the cost, which would be effectively 1 billion. What's your experience of the cost as a percentage of consignment value of customs clearance, and the kind of, where the level might be in your experience?
Well, it's difficult to say depending on the product also, but what I do know is that this actually we are a little bit spoiled also by the customs union which is there, and I do believe that the digitalization of the flows which are happening on the non-EU cargo which are passing through our port now, that we can also transfer that to to the UK cargo now. So we have there a process to go, which we started since the referendum, to try to digitalize every information, excuse me. So that would, of course, that's a process which has an starting process costs, but finally would also have some revenue at the end of the day. So I believe the costs of that would be not the big issue.
More towards 1%. The cost for non-EU into the EU. That's very helpful. And then also, you obviously will be making, I imagine, preparations for Brexit. What preparations has the Port of Zeebrugge been making? Can you tell us about the work you've been undertaking?
Well, there are a lot of preparations, as the colleagues also. That's creating the awareness with companies exporting in our region, because they are not aware, they don't know, or they have only partly cargo to the UK. So I believe there will be a lot of changes. There will be consolidation in the sector, especially in the transport sector, trying to talk to the different public authorities on the continent, on the European side, on the Belgian side, to the customs, to the inspection, how to prepare, how to do that. Of course, also here. Then to look into the contingency plan to see where we're going to store capacity if required, to our border inspection post to prepare parking lots for that. And so that's always also important. But to attract people and to prepare so the customs are having new people there. But what is most important for us is what I said just now, is to create a platform which we call Eric Seaport, which links all our needed information so that we can have actually a paperless customs in the future. So that's a setup we do with the private sector and the public sector, and on that we also talk to our colleagues on the British port side and the different platform, because they have different community systems depending on the ports to link both those. But what for us is the most important that should happen now, and that's a little bit awaiting, is that you asked a question on talks to authorities. So yes, we talk in the UK, we talk to the continent, but the British and the EU, Belgium customs should prepare practical things, and that's too long that they wait to do that. I mean, they are not allowed or whatever it happens, but they should start, because all customs ask really practical questions. You have to transit with your goods. If the hanging system has that also to be declared, it comes back and forward, how many times you have to declare the same thing, all these simple things, and nobody can answer that.
So finally, what information have customs officials in France and Belgium provided ahead of Brexit to French and Belgian port operators?
Well, they all say prepare for the worst. But they say, yeah, we'll try to prepare for the worst. But even that, they do not know the details of that. And that's the point. We should not, I mean, everybody knows what's the decision. So but, okay, let's start on technical things, on technical prepare on practical things. And that should be started immediately, because even the transition period is not certain. They speak about transition, it's more or less decided, but we do not know if it's really decided or not, so that's also a problem.
Thank you. Stephen.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for coming to give evidence this morning. Mr. Keefe, can I ask you a few questions about your written evidence to us? In your written evidence to us, you say the most significant issue at present is there is no pre-existing model of relationship with the EU that completely mitigate disruption and the need for border checks. There is, of course, it's sort of staying in the customs union, or a customs union. But assuming that isn't an option for us, we know Max FAC is effectively dead because it will involve a hard border. So what is the model you would see, or what was the model you'd suggest to the British government?
But the situation with the Channel Tunnel is slightly different, because we're not a port. We're a terminal of entry with a land border and then a rolling motorway that takes people across the channel after they've been through juxtaposed border controls. The juxtaposed nature of the controls means that you do outbound and inbound controls on the same side. So coming into the UK, that happens in Coquelles, the village next door to Calais. You roll through French controls, you roll another 100 metres and you roll through the UK border controls. If you're leaving the UK, it happens in Folkestone. And as Mr. Elphick well knows, the geography of the local south of Kent is quite tightly constrained by the Downs, the White Cliffs, and then by the high-speed railway link that leads to London, and by the M20 motorway that serves both the Channel Tunnel and the port, and then by, in our case, the town of Folkestone. In the ferries instance, it's the town of Dover. So there's very little space available to do anything in the terminal environment, and that means that goods leaving the UK, being controlled particularly by the EU authorities, France on behalf of the EU authorities, will be controlled in Kent. And so that's the issue that we have to resolve. It's how to get a smooth flowing control system that allows traffic to continue to move at the rate that it does today.
So, in your evidence, you, I think, also said to us the government's commitment to a frictionless border can be achieved with the right investment in technology. Smart border technology is essentially ensuring frictionless trade was another statement you made, which is broadly what you've just said. So the obvious question is, what is the right technology that needs to be put in place?
The answer to that, I'm afraid, is down to the specification that's given. Around the world, there is a lot of very good smart border technology. Various different countries, whether they're in, let's say, between Canada and the USA, between Sweden and Norway, between countries.
Both of those are hard borders.
But yeah, absolutely.
But both of those require something like 20% of the lorries being stopped.
I'm not suggesting those methods or those borders, but I'm talking about the technology. And there are elements of that technology that could be used in a smart border environment anywhere. We've been looking at smart borders for something in the region of 5 to 6 years. We believe it's the way to go because of traffic growth, never mind the actual relationship that we have. And we believe it's the way to go both in immigration terms and in the movement of freight. We need the specification, certainly. We need to be looking at the opportunities that exist around the world where the technology has been tested. And then once we've got that, we can build something. But we are in a bit of a vacuum at the moment because we don't know what the specification is.
So also in your evidence, you described presumably this process of introducing technology as a complex and lengthy process. And you went on to say it's already too late to envisage it being in place by March 2019. Assuming that you did have a specification, let's just make that broad and bold assumption at the moment. How long would that complex and lengthy process last? And when, on that basis, post-Brexit, would it be in place?
Again, I'm not avoiding the question, but it does depend on what the specification actually sets out. Because if it's let's not change anything, then that's very simple. If it's we will have to inspect or control in some way every vehicle that goes through, then it's an across the industry type of technology adoption, and that's from the goods at their first point of production. If it's agricultural goods, if it's goods being packaged, it's at the first packaging point. If it's express parcels, then it's at the first point of ordering. Now, in many of those industries, there are already tracking systems that are very sophisticated and very effective. So, again, it really depends on the specification and how we pull it together. That's where we need to get to first.
And just one final question before I ask Mr. Kearns and Mr. Rocher a question. In response to Mr. Elphick, you did say that you're getting guidance or working with government across departments. Have they not given you any guidance as to what you might prepare for in terms of the specification required?
Well, I think at this stage, whilst we're still waiting for the clarity in the negotiation, we can only discuss different scenarios and then take note and be ready that one of them might be the eventual solution.
I'll take that as a polite way of saying no.
Yes, it's not.
Mr. Coates, Mr. Rocher, can I ask you a question, sir, if I may? in the partnership model, and Mr. Keefe has just talked about tracking processes already being in place, and in the partnership model, the government's proposed model is that you track goods to their final destination in order to determine the tariff rate, if any, applies, and presumably also rules of origin certificates as well. 2 weeks ago, when Mr. Thompson, the head of HMRC, gave some evidence, and I know he's giving evidence later, but he told the committee then that he no longer believed that goods tracking was essential to the functioning of that system. Could you explain to us, if that was so, what administrative processes you would have to put in place to make that system work if tracking wasn't essential?
Why would tracking not be essential?
I'm just saying that 2 weeks ago, the head he said that he no longer believed that goods tracking was essential to the processes, the functioning of the processes, and he thought it could be achieved through administrative processes. I'm asking you, do you think that's right? And if so, what administrative processes would you need to put in place to make it work? I mean,
you're saying you think tracking is?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, that's fine. And I assume that's the same, Mr. Rocher.
Today we don't track a lot our goods because the United Kingdom is part of the
Sure,
whole
of course.
single
But
market. But tomorrow
if we were a
have
third
to.
country,
We'll have to,
if
yeah.
we were a third country status, we track.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely we'll have
Okay.
to. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Chair. Mr. Kearns, in the Zeebrugge 2017 annual magazine, which has been provided for us, you're quoted saying that you hope that the European Commission and Parliament will understand that creating problems for the UK is also creating problems for us. Do you think that the European Commission and Parliament fully grasp, if you like, the consequences of a difficult divorce and unnecessary obstacles being put in place between our two countries?
Well, it's clear that there are different parts in Europe, and we are at the region, we are historically linked with the UK, we trade with the UK, and we want to continue that, and not only just as a port, because it's passing through our port, but because our industry is exporting and looking forward to continue that in the future, which is quite different, of course, the deeper down you go in the European Union, and they have other interests. So definitely there is a difference in approach or in affinity with the trade relations with the UK from different sides of Europe. That's also our part of what I assume to be my job, to make awareness in the whole of Europe, and to say that the trade with the UK is important, whatever the context is.
And how proactive do you think the European authorities have been in trying to resolve some of these issues in terms of making sure that whatever option is decided upon will work?
Well, at the end of the day, I believe that they will do, and that will happen, and both parties will do. But the point is that they do not put it in the first place, at the first point of negotiations. So they put other things first.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the discussions that you've had with the Belgian and Mr. Rocher, the French customs authorities, are you able to set out what advice you've been giving them about the options that are available and the concerns that you have? That applies to both of you. The precise nature of the conversations you've been having with your respective national authorities.
Yeah, that we want a free trade agreement, and we want to have as smooth trade as possible. That's clear.
Have they asked you about contingency planning? Are you in touch with them, so preparing for?
Yeah, prepare for the worst.
The worst.
Yes.
Are they asking you for regular updates? Are there plans that you're having to update them about how you're preparing, or?
No, they just ask what we are doing, like you are asking, but not a real.
Not a detailed.
Not a detail. No, not so detail.
Sorry, I mean, I suppose the correlate that would be: are your discussions with them in a better place than they are with our own authorities? I mean, have the European authorities been asking more probing questions?
Both authorities on the both sides are really good partners to talk to, but they should talk to each other.
I can tell. I can see why you're in business. Yeah, exactly. Mr. Rocher.
customs are technical meetings. We explain what we do and what the traffic is, because sometimes, well, I said Paris is quite far from the north coast of France, but we have trade with a lot of different countries, so they are not specialists of this kind of traffic, the short sea to route to the United Kingdom. So it's the first thing. The second thing is just to see how that could work tomorrow, and we prepare for the worst. But then you've got political issues, and the meetings we have with the customs are just technical meetings, and that's it. So we say that we would be very happy if there would be a good agreement which would be signed between the EU and the UK, but that's it. It's just a wish.
No, indeed. One of the issues, and this follows on really from Stephen's question earlier about the idea to which it will be possible to try and facilitate frictionless trade by the UK adjusting our risk tolerance and trying to allow goods to pass with as few checks as possible. Do you agree that's only got limited scope to reduce delays and bottlenecks unless the EU side reciprocates in that way?
It depends on the agreements that would be signed, and actually you will be allowed, once you become an independent country outside the EU, just to choose the risk level you want to implement. But then in France we'll have to adopt the European rules, and they will be the same in Belgium. And I don't really, because once again it's more a political aspect of this topic, and I don't know what will be chosen by the European Union, but we'll have to do what will have been chosen.
We've got HRC representation in the room today, and one of the topics that we touched upon with those officials 2 weeks ago was the discussions that they've been having with port authorities, and I mentioned they've spoken to 12 of them. Have they spoken to either of your respective ports? HMRC as part of their discussions.
Yes, we met several times, Karen Wheeler, for example. But once again, I think the most important question is what will, on our side, what will the EU choose? It's not a problem with the HMRC. HMRC is a British problem, because you will control what you want to control at the frequency you want to control. We will have to apply European rules. So it would be good if there were a European custom authority which could be our referent. But that's not the case today. There are political discussions and then national custom administrations. So every port tries to talk to its own administration. But
yeah, no, indeed, very clearly waiting for your steer. A final question, you may well think this is a political aspect too, is to what extent you think it will be desirable for the UK to retain some form of membership of the European Seaports Organisation after Brexit?
Well, I don't think there is a problem with that.
You would anticipate that we would?
You're still part of the European...
Yes. No, I'm just asking whether you would expect that is sort of factored into your expectations.
I expect a lot of things. I mean, also for us, and the security issue, Europol is there also. I mean, that's also very important, in my opinion, for this migrant problem to stay in. Yes. So there's hopefully, but that's another issue, of course. But ESPO is, yeah, why not? Yes.
So that remains, that's essentially a prevailing assumption, you would say, at this point.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Alison.
Thank you. You mentioned just-in-time logistics in passing. I just wanted to probe a little bit more about that, specifically as it relates to manufacturing and the manufacturing supply chain. So could I just ask all the witnesses just to give a sense of some general information about how much of your business relates to that particular aspect? So like by volume or by value or whatever?
I would say that pretty much all of our business is just in time or time sensitive, and that's why people choose the Channel Tunnel route. We can go up to 8 departures per hour for truck shuttles, and that means that a truck turning up at our terminal even if it misses a departure, will only have to wait a few minutes for the next one. So it is a rolling motorway, it keeps the traffic flowing and nobody loses time. So it means that when delivery deadlines are set to be within a 1 hour or a 2 hour period, then a transporter can guarantee to his end customer that they're going to make that delivery. The just-in-time nature in manufacturing terms has gone another level now, and it's not just in time, it's also just in sequence, and that's a whole different ballgame, because it means that the goods have to arrive in the order of the production line itself. So the example in the car manufacturing industry is that the red car is followed by the blue car, is followed by the green car, and when the truck arrives, the wing mirrors come off, red, blue, green, and they go on to the cars in that order. And if that truck is delayed, then the production line is thrown into disruption. If you then take it into the food world, then we're delivering fresh produce onto shelves 24 hours a day. Our supermarkets are open 24/7, and our customers expect the goods to be there when they want them through the year. So strawberries at Christmas time is now a norm, and people expect that to be delivered by road from Spain through the Channel Tunnel and onto the shelves. And the just when I need it side is the internet retail revolution that has happened over the last 20 or so years, where people can now order goods for next day delivery and even same day delivery. And this means that the continuous flow sometimes a driver is going backwards and forwards through the Channel Tunnel 2 or 3 times per day, bringing deliveries in from warehouses in Belgium or Holland or the north of France, and delivering again and again, and also taking goods out from the UK into those Northern European countries too. So what people pay for it's a premium for time, and customers in the transport industry and customers across all sectors, manufacturing, distribution, retail, pharmaceuticals, are very happy to do that because it gets their produce to the customer when the customer wants it.
For us, it's different actually, because we have this unaccompanied freight and also a lot of automotive, which are of course sometimes in vehicle holding centers in the port of Zeebrugge and waiting for a buyer in the UK to be sent off to the UK. So then just in time is different, because we have warehousing and storage capacity in the port and only delivering up on time. But we have a lot of intermodality, and that's also an important issue, because this intermodality goes by trains from Italy, dropping cargo in the port of Zeebrugge and then bringing it the next day not only to London area, which is the main part of it, but also to the Humber, to the whole High North, and to T-Sport, and even to Scotland. So that's a different chain as the Calais-Dover route, but it's also very just in time to be able to do that intermodality. And I believe that with the Brexit, intermodality will become more important, because truck drivers will be more or less found today in Europe already, and will be less in the picture. So to avoid that, you will have more unaccompanied and more intermodality, which is actually interesting as a development, to see how we can more use combination of train, truck, even barge, and of course the ferry.
And the point there is that the just-in-timeness is not to do with the manufacturing process, but rather to do with the chain,
with the logistic chain. But of course, some are linked to the manufacturing process. I just mentioned in the beginning Honda production factory here, using components, spare parts, whatever. So they have only a stock of 1 hour. So they have need to have the just-in-time, and but to be able to do that, the chain has to be efficient also.
Yeah.
That's how factories work also today, because we talked about strawberries and things like that. It's important for us, obviously, but that's the whole business of different car factories or chemical factories, medicine factories, and that's how they work. That's how they have to work, because that's how it works all over the world. So if they can't work like this any longer. They will have to buy longer stocks. It will be very expensive for them. There might be stops in the productions, which will be very, very important also. So they will be less competitive. And as you know, if a factory is less competitive, there are risks of either lowering its size or changing and sending it to the continent. So it's very vital for the UK economy.
None of the firms in the UK that this affects, you know, would want to volunteer that this was an existential issue for them in the UK. But given your experience in working with these firms, would you say that it was?
I think one of the things which has become apparent in the last sort of 20 or so years is that warehousing has disappeared, apart from in the port of Zeebrugge. But in manufacturing chains, the warehouse is rolling on the road. It's moving all of the time because that's the most productive, most efficient way to do it. So if that sort of highly complex logistics chain doesn't operate efficiently, then it immediately adds cost into any process, whether it's the process of retailing fresh produce to consumers or of making something. You have to store goods, and storing goods costs money. In the manufacturing process, that money is then added onto the end product. If it's in fresh, then the product is losing value every moment that it's stored. So every moment between picking and eating, the quality of the product is going off. And in some cases, it can't actually be delivered fresh. So the range of choice disappears. So in every sense, adding disruption into the logistics chain that supplies time-sensitive goods.
So even actually a relatively small margin of time might be make or break.
A small margin of time is in the EY report that was published yesterday, fresh produce is going off at sort of 5% per hour. So in terms of value, it's losing that as it's being delayed between picking and delivery.
Okay. I just want to also ask about the balance between risks in terms of time and delay that arise from leaving the customs union and risks that arise from leaving the single market. So do you think that what additional risks does leaving the single market raise, just in terms of the rules of origin checks, for example, or other regulatory requirements? We'd already mentioned sanitary standards somewhat, but would anyone like to comment a little further about what does leaving the single market imply?
Adding to what's said and trying to answer your question is the costs are an element. So if you have to add checks, add control, add storage, it's in a certain way adding value, but value has to be paid. And so somebody has to pay. So if Honda has to, I repeat Honda, but doesn't take another one, has to wait longer, then it means a cost for them. So that makes the products more. Suppose there is no trade agreements, so then they have the duties or whatever. So that's also taxes. So then the cost, that's not good for both sides, in my opinion. That should be avoided because that makes products more expensive here, which is not interesting, I think, but also which makes European products more expensive, which is not good for the export in Europe. So the costs is a risk, I believe, to increase the final product cost.
Do you think that's more? Do you think that the potential tariff cost is greater, is a greater problem than the potential for spending time dealing with complicated rules of origin checks, for example?
Well, it adds all to each other.
Okay, so both, it's all.
Yeah.
Anything that adds time into this equation, whether it's time filling out documents at the point of dispatch, whether it's so needing more people to actually complete information that's required, whether it's ensuring that a process is documented properly and information is exchanged at the right times, it's a system or it's people. All of those things are timed somewhere. Anything that physically stops the flow of traffic can be considered to be a failure in the warehouse. The goods are not being delivered. The impact isn't necessarily on the transporter or on the cross-channel carrier, because the goods will still be going backwards and forwards, but there's a creeping impact on industry because they're not getting goods in a timely manner, or on consumers because they're not getting the choice and the quality of goods that they're expected. And just when I need it is, I need it now, not in 2 or 3 days, and I've become used to getting it now. So there's a cost to me in terms of quality terms. So the place that we need to be is ensuring that whatever the specification that's given in the agreement, that when it's eventually reached, it allows all of those things to be dealt with, so that we're not delaying goods, we're not causing disruption to the economic chain, because at the end of the day, it's the factories and the consumers that are the beneficiaries of the way this process works.
Okay, but basically your message is time is money, and the more checks and regulatory involvement there has to be, the more time that will take.
Yeah.
Just want to Mr. Rocher, just on sanitary checks, and I think that if there were to be sanitary checks, that would require border inspection posts.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking that there aren't such posts at Calais at the moment?
They do not exist.
So you would have to put all that in. And Mr. Coons, in terms of automotive, have any, or perhaps Mr. Keefe as well, you both talked about it, have any automotive companies spoken to you? I mean, we've talked a lot about government authorities and organisations, but have any individual companies spoken to you about contingency planning, how they would get the parts they need when they need them, in the event of there to be no clear agreement, no deal?
No, the automotive sector is very, very, how we say, into the project, into the subjects, talking to everybody to avoid problems. Yes, we have a common interest in players like Toyota producing in France or producing in UK, and how it will go, how will third cargo coming also in transit, how that will work. It's very uncertain for them. It's a very important sector.
Mr. Rocher, would you agree with that? They're talking, and are any of them talking about potentially completely changing where they manufacture goods on the basis that they just don't, they want to cross, potentially not cross the UK-EU border?
Exactly.
Well, they have many aspects if they have to produce here, but all their components, all their elements come from the continent, and that will be import duty on that, so their final product will be more expensive. That will be difficult because they produce here not for the UK market but for export. On the other hand, the logistics, they might have some direct calls here also. That's also a possibility. That's not good for us, maybe for the British ports, but if they have the space to do that, that's another issue. So there are many uncertainty on that, so it's for them, yes.
Okay.
And there are factories on the continent,
absolutely,
which are maybe not totally busy, so they can change their way of producing things. And some parts just cross 3 times the channel.
Absolutely.
So it's very, very...
But are you aware that some companies then are looking at moving manufacturing back to the
Not directly, but we know they're worried. It's the same thing for Airbus. I read an article about that because...
No, absolutely. Rushnara.
Thank you. Good morning. You'll be aware that the UK government has proposed 2 options for how customs regimes might work post-Brexit. The first option being the highly streamlined customs arrangement, also known as MaxFAT, not to be confused with a makeup company, and the other being the new customs partnership. Mr. Thompson, the head of HMRC, who will be giving evidence shortly, told this committee that one of the risks of the highly streamed customs arrangement is that there's no guarantee that EU ports such as Calais would have implemented the necessary arrangements in time, even if the agreement was there between the UK and the EU. Do you think you'll be in a position to implement the sorts of changes required by the highly streamlined customs arrangement by January 2021, Mr. Rocher?
We'll have to anyway. We'll have to.
But would you be able to?
Today, Calais is a very tiny port. I don't know if you've already crossed the channel via Calais. We are building a new port, so we'll have some spare space. What's more, there's a factory that has been dismantled a few years ago just close to the port, so we'll be able to find some land, because it's a question of land, and then we'll have to build things on these parcels. But the first thing is just to find the appropriate space in order to build holes and things like that, so that the customs and the sanitary inspection would be able to do their job.
And you can do that within the time frame?
Clock is running. Time is running, yeah.
Sorry?
Time is running, so we need to have the...
I hear words like we have to and we need to, but will you be able to? Can you give us a commitment that you can absolutely do that? Yes or no?
We'll do that.
Sorry?
Yeah, anyway, we will have no choice, so we can't close the port, so we will do what we will have to do.
Just in terms of costs, have you got an idea of what that would cost?
Once again, it depends on the solution that will be found. But I think it will definitely be expensive, because once again we're building a new port, and these new port plans had been drawn in before the Brexit, so we had not planned anything for extra controls for lorries coming from the United Kingdom. So it can't be included in the actual work, and I think the cost would be at least 20 million. 20 million euros.
Yeah. And in terms of for everyone, who in terms of the breakdown of the administrative burden, where do you see that going between government, business, and the port authorities? The sort of the distribution. Who will bear those costs? Who would like to come in? Mr. Keefe?
The consumer will bear the costs.
It will be passed on to consumers.
At the end of the day, whichever route is chosen to pay for the costs up front, at the end of the day, they get passed down through the chain. So the bigger the cost in developing the more that will eventually find its way through. I don't think there's any other way to look at this. Businesses can absorb a certain amount of additional costs from additional legislative requirements, and does on a regular basis. That's our part of the arrangement. But at the end of the day, if the impact is across the whole of the supply chain and across the whole of the economy, then inevitably at some point that gets passed down to the consumer.
Okay. But the costs that we're talking about for the ports, I mean, again, that's something that obviously the three of your organisations at other ports have to absorb. Again, you would expect eventually to recoup that in terms of presumably people paying to access your services.
Again, it's part of the process. We will constantly be looking for the time advantage. We'll constantly be looking for the best technology or the best solution to ensure that our customers can get across as quickly as possible. And our customers want that speed, and they are prepared to pay the premium for it. But the premium just changes.
HMRC recently told us that they've been sharing the technical specifications underpinning their highly streamlined customs arrangements with ports, so that they can think in advance of the changes they need to make. Have you had sight of these? Has anyone had sight of these?
Got a meeting the beginning of July, 4th of July.
Sorry?
I think a meeting is planned at the port of the on the 4th of July. So I think we know.
Great, thank you. And I just have one final question. At this stage, do you think it's possible or likely that either the partnership model will be ready for implementation without extending the transition period? I know you said that you have to do it within the deadline. It'd be interesting to know what others think as well. And do you think that that period is sufficient to make the adjustments for the new period?
The transition period of 2 years is fine.
Yeah.
Provided that we know from the beginning of that transition period what we have to do. If this transition period means uncertainty during the transition period, then we will never be ready. Never. It's not possible. I mean, even you say, okay, it's already 2 years, but we do not know yet what has to be there. So if we know what has to be there, then a transition period of 2 years is fine to prepare, I think.
So, in summary, it all feels very complex and overwhelming to those listening. Wouldn't it just be better to stay with the customs union? Wouldn't life be a lot easier for everybody, and the cost would be
definitely easier.
Mitigated.
The business we're in relies on keeping traffic moving. We're in the transport industry. We move things from A to B. We help service the whole of the logistics supply chain that serves industry and consumers on both sides of the channel. It works when it flows smoothly.
Mr. Rocher, did you want to add anything?
That's a very good conclusion.
Life would be easier. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to those who've provided, I know, written evidence as well. If there is anything further that arises after you've left today and you want to make any further points or anything in further evidence, please do feel free to write to the committee. We'd be very grateful to hear from you. There are lots of things still to be sorted out, as I think you've highlighted in your evidence this morning. So as they perhaps become clear, it would be helpful to hear from you again. But for this morning, we're very grateful to you for your time, and thank you very much for making the effort to be here. Thank you. So a short break while we just swap the panels over. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much indeed for being here. I know you just sat through the previous session as well, and hopefully we're going to pick up from where we left off last time. I think you also just heard the evidence that has been given as well. I'm sure there'll be questions about that. Just for the sake of those watching, not in the room, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Ms. Wheeler, let me start with you.
Karen Wheeler, I'm the Director General in charge of Border Delivery Group.
Thank you.
John Thompson, I'm the Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs.
I'm Jim Harrer, Second Permanent Secretary in HMRC.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much. I wanted just to start actually with something that did come up, I think, in the last session, which was this lack of specification in terms of the ports of Zeebrugge and Calais, but also in terms of Getlink being able to make preparations. And I just wondered, perhaps Thompson, whether you'd like to comment on that. I mean, is it a fact that the specification can't really be given to ports until the political agreement has been negotiated as to the end state relationship?
So I think it's worth differentiating, and then probably Karen ought to very specifically answer your question, because the specification only arises for the witnesses that you just talked to in the event of implementing the highly streamlined customs partnership.
Right.
Under the new customs partnership, then those ports would largely be unaffected and have very, very little to do because the options are mutually exclusive. Yeah. I believe we've reached the point where we have a draft specification, but I think Karen may be able to give you some more information.
Thank you. Yes.
I guess it just depends what specification you're talking about.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, what would you be, when we talk about specification, what would you be expecting that to mean from HMRC's perspective?
Okay, so, and Jim will probably be the more authorised version of this, but the specification for a system, for how a system would operate for the Ro-Ro ports in particular, but in that there is an equivalent specification that is needed for Eurotunnel, which is obviously different. That specification is not a technical specification, but it is written down as a requirement of what we expect the ports to try to achieve. Right. So it's not a technical system specification per se. It is written down, it has been shared and made available to the UK Ro-Ro ports, and those discussions are starting to happen with individual ports. So HMRC is having individual discussions with Dover, Portsmouth, other ports.
But UK ports?
UK ports, yes. So that hasn't been made available to member state ports because obviously it's not their job to build those systems. What we are trying to do in some of the conversations that we have had with Mr. Cohen's in Zeebrugge and Benoit in Calais and so on, is to just talk about how we see it working on our side, so that we can make sure that we are trying to work together and collaborate where we can in terms of common approaches which come together at the border. But Jim, you may, I don't know if you want to add more detail on that.
Yes, so we made that detailed requirement for the new RoRo service available to ports, I think, in April, in draft. And then since April, we've been engaging with them port by port to make sure we've got a common understanding of that requirement, to make sure we've got an understanding of what the impact of that requirement is on each port and how each port would go about meeting it. I'd expect that to be an iterative process. They will think about how they're going to meet it. We will think about how we maybe need to change the requirement to reflect their needs. So that is fairly detailed and is in place. That covers both the types of systems and data that we will require to enable us to maintain fluid clearance for customs, but we're also engaging now port by port on the sort of what the physical infrastructure requirements are as well, any bricks and mortar that we require for temporary storage or for inspection facilities.
Okay. So last time I want to move on to looking at figures again. Last time you quoted just a couple of headlines, Mr Thompson, when you gave us a figure of costs to UK business annually of between 17 to 20 billion pounds for the highly streamlined arrangement. I just wanted to go back into those in sort of a little bit more detail, and thank you very much for the letter as well that you have written to us. I know you've also replied to a letter from Mr Clark. I think he's going to have some questions on this as well. The letter that you've written to us has been published this morning before this session. So let's starting with the cost of customs declarations. You started, I think in the letter it says between £15 and £55.
Yes.
Could you just talk us through the sources of those figures?
So there are three independent reports. One is by Ipsos Mori from July 2015 called Understanding Tax Administrations for Business. There's a second report by KPMG in January 2018, actually conducted for the Dutch government, called The Impact of Non-Tariff Barriers of the United Kingdom Leaving the European Union. And thirdly, one from Nottingham Business School from September 2013 called Trade and Customs Procedures Compliance Costs. All three of those reports give ranges, and essentially they give ranges because there are 5 different sorts of businesses involved. In our assessment, there are 5 different sorts of businesses involved in this. So there are those who would be at the lower end would be high volume traders who have insourced the administration of customs and therefore are very, very familiar with the process. They would employ people to do it. They may have invested in the necessary technology. They'd be at the lower end. But you've got high volume traders who outsource it. Those are above the VAT threshold, but it's still relatively low volume, and they would outsource it. Under the VAT threshold, so you've now got small businesses who are doing some sorts of exports, and then you've separately got to consider the question of parcel operators. So the way we see businesses in those 5 categories, we've done quite a lot of work with those 5 businesses about what does it cost. Our own work then supports the various ranges. If I were to summarise the 3 independent reports, Ipsos Mori concluded in July 2015 that the average agent's fee is £41 per declaration. So that's well within that range I gave you, or if you're completing it in-house, it takes between 63 and 150 minutes. So it depends how you value the cost of the time. KPMG's view was that it costs between 32 and 62 euros for an export and between 40 and 65 euros for an import, and they settle on various averages, but again both well within the range. And Nottingham Business School conclude that it's between £25 and 70 pence and £55. Okay. So again, you've got three references there.
And I think you talked about the £32.50 figure that you sort of took as an average was literally just an average between the highs and the lows.
It's a weighted average, but yeah, you can argue somewhere in that range, but 32.50 feels to us like about the appropriate.
You talk about different types of businesses, but presumably there are also different industries might have different costs, and is that included in your calculations as well?
Not per se. The various studies that I've quoted to you are in different sectors. So the Nottingham Business School work is specifically in relation to the meat trade. The KPMG work is for a range of different businesses across the Netherlands, and our work is across 151 businesses and 81 agents across a range of different sectors. So we haven't then tried to further split this by what would it be between manufacturing or food or chemicals or something.
Okay. And then you also talked, I think we touched on the cost of rules of origin, and I think you talked about several £billion. Is there any more detail that you're able to provide on that?
No, I can't be as specific in the calculation as that which I set out in answers to Roshana Ali's questions from 2 weeks ago, because there are multiple different ways in which you can satisfy the rules of origin requirement. But for any free trade agreement between any two countries, rules of origin are a requisite for the tariff differential. So you'll need to be able to demonstrate that these goods are from the country of origin in order to be able to access lower tariffs under a free trade agreement.
Now, have you been challenged on those figures, either before 2 weeks ago or since you appeared before the committee, either by government departments or by ministers or by Downing Street?
And I don't think there's been much debate within the civil service. There have clearly been some reaction to.
I'm not talking about media. I'm talking about more about sort of within Whitehall, within civil service or ministers to you or to your senior officials on those figures.
So the estimate we've given, I'm looking at Jim to see whether there's been any much debate, but the estimate we've given has been in ministerial papers.
So those figures have been shared across Whitehall because they obviously underpin various pieces of advice that have been given. I'm not aware. So they went through an internal sort of validation process and challenge process within Whitehall before we firmed up on them. I'm not aware that in the last 2 weeks there's been any challenge or any difference to them.
I mean, the reason I'm asking this question is because those figures were described after your appearance before as speculative. Would you refute that description?
Well, they're speculative in the sense that the government still has a number of different policy options on the table. I mean they've been professionally queried by a couple of economists. I'm happy to respond to the alternative methodology, which I think Mr. Elphick asked a previous question about of the previous witnesses. I'm happy to go into the alternative
if you can, that would be helpful. Yeah.
So there are two ways in which you could try to estimate the costs. One is top down, which is the example that you gave, which was a percentage of the value of trade. Or alternatively, you can do it bottom up on the basis of how many declarations are there and what's the cost of a declaration, which is the evidence that I set out 2 weeks ago. The reason that we do not believe that the top-down estimate of attaching a percentage value to the value of trade, the reason we don't believe that is sound is because it assumes that the nature of trade between the United Kingdom and the rest of the world is similar to the nature of trade between the United Kingdom and European Union states. And as I think you heard from previous witnesses, the very nature of just-in-time logistics and groupage, two particular features here, would indicate fairly clearly to us, and indeed to a number of other European Union tax authorities, that the value of your intra-EU trade is lower on average, but it's a much higher frequency. So you roughly have the same value of trade between the United Kingdom and the EU and the United Kingdom and the rest of the world, and I'll give you all those statistics if you want, but in general, intra-EU trade is lower value, higher volume than the rest of the world because of this nature of just-in-time logistics, and quite often goods crossing over multiple times in the production chain and so on. So.
Well, I think we heard that actually. I think it was Mr. Rocher before who said about some automotive components crossing the over the channel 3 times in terms of manufacture. I just wanted to go on. So you talked about the recurrent cost to government of the new arrangements being about £250 million a year for highly streamlined and £180 million a year for the partnership model. Are there any more details? Can you explain any more key drivers of those costs?
So I think I was really clear with you that that was a very early estimate because the nature of negotiations with the Treasury is such that it's being done year by year in accordance with the negotiations. And I think I also said to you that I was if I'd have been the Treasury, that's the way I would also have done it. So the fundamental difference in terms of the administration for HMRC is the fact that the new custom partnership would require no customs declarations, whereas a highly streamlined customs arrangement does require customs declarations. So we currently have a national customs hub in Salford that processes the 55 million customs declarations that are required for the rest of the world. That employs almost 750 people or thereabouts, and so we would have to expand that under the highly streamlined customs arrangement, and that's the main driver for the additional cost in highly streamlined. But in the new customs partnership, you don't have that. But alternatively, you do have the administration of the dual tariff, and you have the administration of the repayment mechanism.
Yeah.
But all round for us, we think that would be a lower cost. As I said, that is a very early estimate from us. It almost certainly would change, but it is reasonable to think that in administrative terms, highly streamlined would be slightly more expensive.
I think suitable for spending review as well. So
thank you very much. I'll quote.
Now, the £17-20 billion is for the highly streamlined arrangement. What about a figure for no deal at all, crashing out and ending up on WTO-type terms? Is that something that has been able to be calculated?
So so we need to be really, really clear. That is definitely not the government's preferred option, is it? And it's not the government's plan, and the government's been very, very clear about where we are. But nevertheless, that would. If we move to WTO rules, then that would definitely require customs declarations.
So it would
be similar.
Similar.
Sorts of costs.
Okay. I wanted just to ask about VAT as well at the borders. So obviously after Brexit, imports to the UK will become liable for import VAT, which has to be paid before goods can be released into free circulation. And I just wondered what work HMRC had done on that in terms of looking at costs and impact on customers, and particularly obviously for things like imports of components. And if you could perhaps talk us through where you are on that.
So I think Jim will lead, but to remind the committee that we exchanged some correspondence about this.
That's right.
But we do not believe it's a quantum problem, but rather a timing challenge. But I'm sure Jim can get you further into that.
Thank you.
So at the moment, VAT on imports from the rest of the world is administered through the customs procedures. So those import declarations are used not just to calculate any customs duty that may be due, but also to calculate the import VAT, and that's normally payable on the 15th day of the following by the 15th day of the following month. Obviously, for intra-EU movements, there are no customs declarations, so that's not the procedure that we use to calculate the VAT on those movements. And instead, we've got a simplified process that applies right across the EU, where if you've got a business-to-business movement, so the business in the exporting state will zero rate that movement. The business in the UK in the receiving state will then have to put that on their VAT return. If they're then entitled to and account for that VAT on the VAT return, if they're then also entitled to treat that as an input tax, basically they put that in the VAT return as well, and it cancels out. So if import VAT were to be introduced on a rest of the world basis when we leave the EU, clearly you can see that there'd be a cash flow impact on businesses that does not exist today. The government has recognised that, and in the autumn budget statement, the government said that it recognised the importance of that simplified arrangement to business and the cash flow advantage that it provides, and that the government will, of course, take that into account when considering any potential changes following EU exit. So we are aware that it is an issue. The government has not yet announced what its decision is on that, but it has made it clear that it's aware of the cash flow disadvantage and it wants to
quantum of imports. Could the system cope with, leaving aside businesses having to get used to a new system and cash flow implications, could the HMRC systems cope with VAT having to be levied now on intra-EU trade?
Yes, because if we move from to an import VAT system, then it is the customs declaration that drives that. So we are scaling up our customs system, both the new customs declaration system and the existing chief system, to cope with the increased volume of customs declarations that will result. We estimate that will go up from 50 to 55 million to about 255 million, and that will work for both customs and for the VAT process. So that scaling is built into our plans.
Okay. Simon, do you have a supplementary? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for coming in. And thank you, Mr. Thompson, for your letter to me in response to my queries. I'm actually going to refer to your letter to the Chair in regard to the costings of all the different options. And in that letter, you set out there's going to be some additional 205 million customs declarations for the intra-EU trade. which we currently see, which is roughly valued at £357 billion, and that works out therefore at one customs declaration for each £1,800 worth of trade. Now that compares to the 55 million customs declarations for the 339 billion of non-EU trade, which works out at one customs declaration for each £6,200 of trade. So obviously, you say that reflects the different nature of the consignments that travel between, say, Britain and France compared to, say, between Britain and America.
Yes.
Would you expect an adjustment in the way in which those consignments are packaged up, as it were? That is to say, would you expect people to consolidate consignments in such a way as to try and mitigate the frequency of those transactions, of those shipments?
So it's possible. So to be really clear about the estimate is what's called a static estimate. So it assumes no changes in behaviour. It is, of course, possible that businesses might change their behaviour. They might package up consignments. They may have larger consignments and so on and so forth. But this is a static estimate on the basis of current patterns of trade and trade values.
Has anyone done any modelling based upon, I mean, obviously, I think of countries like Japan and Korea, which have quite integrated economies, and they must have just-in-time supply chains over there. The extent to which they manage this, and obviously they don't have a form of customs partnership, and so it's just trying to understand how other highly developed market economies in close geographical proximity manage this kind of situation without massive additional cost to business.
If we have done that,
I'd just be interested to know whether there's any precedent out with the European area about how countries manage this, because it does seem to me that there must be ways that you can at least mitigate, even if you can't completely.
There may indeed be ways in which it can be mitigated. So I mean, you could have a larger number. You could package up the goods into a smaller number of consignments with a higher average value. There are then consequences of that, as you heard from some of the earlier witnesses about what does that then mean in terms of warehousing. What the just-in-time system does is, of course, is absolutely minimise the working capital that's tied up in terms of ordering goods in your supply chain. There are aspects of the flows of trade within the European Union that even so may still not suit that, because they are, for example, fresh food. It's difficult to envisage that you can package up more than one truck of fresh produce from Spain or whatever. But nevertheless, it is perfectly possible, and one would expect businesses to act economically rationally, look at what that additional cost is that it's presenting to them, and then respond. I think there's one thing that hasn't possibly come across, which is the multiplier. When we gave evidence last time, said it was £6.5 billion, and then you had to multiply it by two.
Two, yes.
I think the thing which is possibly not as explicit as it should be, both in terms of the evidence we gave you last time and indeed the letter, is that additional 6.5 billion occurs on the other side. So it's 6.5 billion for UK businesses, but it's 6.5 billion for EU businesses.
Yes.
Because now they're having to do import and export declarations for the UK. So the 13 billion, just to clarify the point that you made, does not fall entirely on the UK side of it. And this issue is explored in the KPMG report for the Netherlands government, which estimates that the cost impact for Dutch businesses is between 390 and 630 million euros a year. So that's, if you like, their fraction of the estimated 6.5 billion.
Does that not therefore mean that the actual cost of the max FAC arrangement therefore is more of an order of, it's rather than being 17 to 20, more of 11 to 14? If in fact, if we're talking about purely the cost on British business as opposed to in toto.
You could argue that it's also possible to argue it the other way around, which is those costs might be passed on. Mm-hmm. So it depends on how you see the economics.
I mean, the reason why we've calculated in the way we have is that we've looked at the total additional costs on the whole of trade, because in terms of its macroeconomic impact, that is relevant. So it's falling on the trade somewhere, even if it's on an EU business, that still has an impact. But you're right that in terms of the incidence of the costs, some of it will be in UK businesses and some of it will be on EU businesses.
In terms of the role that freight forwarders and customs agents can play in helping people to manage these costs as sensibly as possible. And the HMRC website observes that customs agents may use their experience to lower your transport costs by processing your goods as part of a larger consignment. To what extent do you think they can accelerate this process?
So agents are a vital part of the ecosystem here, and the work which Ipsos Mori did in 2015 actually worked with 81 agents to talk about what's their role, how much do they charge. There's quite a wide range. Now, in relation to the highly streamlined customs arrangement, we believe that the market would need to expand. And it's part of our considerations with ministers. We've highlighted the fact the market would need to expand, and there's a question about whether the government might stimulate that market expanding, or whether the market would just naturally expand because there's increased demand. But yes, we absolutely agree with you that it's a vital part of it. They offer a wide range of services, and it's all freely available. It's fairly easy to find out that they will package up different things in different ways. Some of which will be that they can complete your customs declaration for you for a fee.
And finally, I just wanted to touch on the constituent elements of MaxFac. And in the first page of your letter to the chair, you set out some of the key aspects of those, which is very helpful, and thank you. I was hoping for when we spoke about this at the last evidence session, almost for a sort of a checklist that we could do this definitely by January 21, or this one perhaps 2022. In the letter, but the only one that you specifically highlight which you don't think might be ready in full by January 21 is the arrangements surrounding Ro-Ro. Is that the only element which you think overruns the transition period, if that is in fact secured?
It's certainly the one, the implementation of the technology required in order to operate the Ro-Ro, the mutual aspects of highly streamlined on both sides. So, for example, Dover to Calais, the implementation of that technology is the one that I think has the longest lead time in our plan. The reason that I'm being careful is because I think in previous sessions, either at this committee or others, the way I've tried to explain the risks basically fall into three groups. Those which are directly controllable by the government, for example, the implementation of the Customs Declaration Service, those which are with UK businesses, and those which are beyond the United Kingdom, in other words, they're with the European Union or member states of the European Union. And if you like, our influence over it diminishes as you go from 1 to 2 to 3. So the government can directly control some risks, has significant influence over the second set. We can influence what ports do, but in the end, it will be for colleagues that you saw to take the necessary action with the European Union or their member states or whatever governance they've got. And we are all being careful with ministers that is an aspect over which
I appreciate
and the government don't have control.
That's an eminently reasonable position. Can I have one final one, which is just to say that given that the EU is a signatory to the WTO agreement on trade facilitation, is the EU not under international legal obligation to implement large parts of MaxFac anyway?
I have to admit that I had not thought about that question, but Jim, do you want to try?
You're right. WTO rules mean that all members of WTO are supposed to facilitate trade. I don't think that requires them to agree specific simplifications either bilaterally or multilaterally, which is why all of these would be subject to negotiation with the EU in terms of a jointly implemented solution. But I would expect, going into negotiations with them, that they are mindful of that requirement and also mindful of the interests of their own member states. But I don't believe it translates into meaning that I can say you are legally obliged to implement simplification X or simplification Y.
Well, if there are any further thoughts on that after the session, it might be helpful to hear that. Alistair.
I want to move to the Irish border, but before we do that, when we spoke a few weeks ago, Mr. Thompson, you said to me that under a new customs partnership and the rules of origin, goods coming to the UK to go to Europe, we would have to pick up the tariff and pass it across. that you didn't believe that the EU would want to do reciprocate, was exactly the word you used, on that arrangement. And my question that I wanted to ask you then, but we ran out of time, was have you got an idea of the figure of what the UK would collect in tariffs to pass the UK and vice versa? And I'm going to bring the question all to one head, and if so, would potentially an offset system work to solve that problem? Would an offset system work? Do you have an idea of the amounts, first and foremost, from either side of the border?
So you're correct that is the answer I gave you, but I think Jim then corrected the answer that I gave you in the session that we had to say it was actually being negotiated. I think I was too definite with you that we did not require the reciprocation, but actually it was being negotiated. Is that right?
Yes, so reciprocity is one possibility, and that would be subject to the negotiations. We are doing some work to look at, if there was not reciprocity, how would you mitigate some of the risks associated with that in relation to the UK if, for example, we operated higher tariffs or had different trade remedies from the EU. In terms of the amount of the tariff that the UK would collect, that it would retain for itself or that it would pass on to the EU, that is a matter for the negotiations with the EU, so I don't have any figures that I can give you at this time.
So on the Irish border then, with regards to the max fact model, in order to remove the need for customs infrastructure, when we last spoke, you said you believed this could be avoided through the use of administrative procedures. And I just wondered if you could elaborate specifically on what those administrative procedures would involve.
Yes, so in the two papers that the government published last year in August and then the white paper in October, we set out some information on this. So we believe that the sort of vanilla, highly streamlined customs arrangement in itself would not remove the need for a hard border in Ireland, and therefore if you implement the highly streamlined customs arrangement you have to have a further specific arrangements in place in Ireland in order to achieve that. So we have suggested a couple of things. First of all, for the very large the sort of large number of very small businesses trading in what is in effect a local economy across the border, that you would sort of relieve them from any customs responsibilities, so they would not have to, their goods would not have to move under customs control, and they would not have to complete any declaration.
So that's the trusted trader scheme and the small trader exemptions.
Yes.
But if the EU rejected those, what would the implication be on the model?
Well, both the UK and the EU are committed to there being no hard border in Ireland, and the aim would be to achieve that through whatever the general economic partnership is between the UK and the EU. So if it was decided to negotiate something like the highly streamlined customs arrangement, then we would both be looking to build into that either general features that apply across the UK that would work in Ireland, or specific measures. The UK has put forward what it thinks would be required. It would be for the negotiations with the EU to come up with something different if that's not the way it would be done.
Okay, and how burdensome do you think that would be? I mean, the burden's going to fall on business. Is there a number that you've worked out?
So obviously the aim of that would be to relieve businesses from burden. So small businesses would be completely relieved from the obligation. From the obligation to complete customs declarations, that would not and to comply with any customs processes. That would not only mean that there is no need for any checks or infrastructure at the border, but it would also mean that they would not be subject to the kind of administrative costs that John was talking about in his evidence.
Thank you. The backstop arrangement. The Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney has said there'll be no withdrawal treatment if there isn't a backstop dealing with the Irish border, and that the negotiation of the long-term customs arrangement would take a lot of time. Do you agree with him that the backstop arrangement is a more urgent priority? Mr. Thompson, well, either of you.
Well, I think we work on all of this in parallel. The UK government and the EU both remain committed to what they agreed in December, which includes the need for an operative backstop in any withdrawal agreement. The proposal that the EU has put forward is one that the UK government has said will not be acceptable to the UK, and that the UK is committed to producing an alternative proposition and entering into a withdrawal agreement that includes the backstop in accordance with the December agreement. That is all part of the negotiations for the withdrawal agreement, all of which will need to be in place.
And when do you think when do you think the backstop agreement would need to be agreed? What's the sort of cliff edge, if you like?
Well, that's not really for me to say. It's for those leading the negotiations. The government is committed that in the withdrawal agreement there will be an operative backstop.
Thank you. Charlie.
Good morning. I'm quite interested, first of all, in a letter I received from Treasury Minister Mel Stride. He said that the aim was to keep VAT as close as possible to the European Union rules as it is now. Is that your understanding?
It is our plan that at the point when we exit the EU, there will be minimal changes, both for VAT and across all the processes that we operate, so that on day one, things are as familiar as possible to people. However, the government is clear that when we leave the EU, we will be recovering sovereignty over our tax policy, and that it is open to change that policy in the future, subject to any negotiations with the EU. But the bill that is going through Parliament at the moment gives us the ability to start on day one with processes that look very similar, and therefore our aim would be to change those on day one to the minimum required to cope with exit, and then thereafter it would be for UK governments and UK parliaments to decide what they want to do.
Thank you. At the moment, half our trade is with the rest of the world under so-called WTO terms. What is the average overall cost, or percentage-wise, of the value of the trade in goods of customs compliance in that connection?
Well, it's somewhere between 1% and 3%.
Right. Okay, so it's between 1 and 3%.
So there are the value of trade between the United Kingdom and the rest of the world in goods in 2016 was £393 billion. That required 55.5 million customs declarations, plus various rules of origin documentation. It's estimated that cost was between 1 and 3% of the trade value, the 393 billion number.
Right. And you said that last time you said it was going to cost 20 billion, which is about 10%, or was it 10 to 15%?
I don't understand how anyone's got to 10%. The value of trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union goods is £382 billion.
So effectively, that would be then 6%.
So 17 to 20 billion is somewhere between, he said, trying to do the maths quickly, 4 to 7%.
Okay.
And the reason for that is in answer to the Chair's questions about the nature of the flows of trade within the European Union have a lower value and a much higher frequency because of the integrated supply chain across the European Union.
Well, let's just look at that, because you've mentioned groupage. If you had an accounting system where the hauliers or authorised economic operators were responsible for accounting, very much like employers are responsible for accounting PAYE, would that not bring the costs down? Would that not make sure that effectively you could bring the accounting costs down with such a technique like that?
So one of the easements which we've explored is whether we could have more authorised economic operators and whether they could adopt a self-assessment scheme for aspects of this, but it doesn't remove the fundamental that WTO rules and I'll speculate the European Union will both require customs declarations. If the UK is going to comply with WTO rules, we think it's a reasonable assumption to assume that we'd also like customs declarations for a range of different reasons.
And then looking at the new customs partnership, that depends on robust rules of origin being effectively accepted by our European Union trading partners after leaving the European Union. Can you realistically provide that level of assurance without using a blockchain system?
So you've leapt from reassurance to a potential technology solution, which one doesn't necessarily flow from the other. So to answer your primary question, yes, we would need to provide assurance to the European Union in relation to the rules of origin of the goods that are entering the United Kingdom that would then freely flow across the border into the European Union. How exactly that would be done is still a matter over which we are talking to the industry. Blockchain may be an answer in highly automated, highly digitalised systems, but you shouldn't assume that that is the very nature of all of business between the United Kingdom and the European Union. So, but for high volume businesses, it's possible that might be a technology solution, yes. It's not really, it wouldn't be for us to decide, if we're being honest about it. It would be for the industry, as I think you heard from some of the earlier witnesses.
But I mean, don't you think it's pretty critical that if we're going to float something like new customs partnership, which you have been,
yep,
that you know how it's going to work and you've got a clear idea of how you're going to be able to provide assurance on origination? You can't just go in there with a half-baked scheme.
No. I very specifically split your question into two to give you the assurance that we would have to provide rules of origin in the way that we do now for rest of Europe trade that arrives at Felixstowe is quite often unloaded at Felixstowe, put on the back of a lorry and then travels around within the single market. Those sorts of rules of origin arrangements would continue. The second half of your question, which is that you've leapt to and therefore the technology solution is X, isn't necessarily the case. So if we switch back to highly streamlined and the question of the specification may well conclude that it would be for individual ports to decide what is the best solution for them, not for us to say you shall do X, Y, and Z, because with the greatest of respect, those people know their businesses better than we do.
And then just heading back to this issue of the costs, which you say under max VAT would be 5%. Douglas McWilliams, founder of the Centre for Economics and Business Research, thinks that you've muddled together consignments and containers. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, there have been numerous comments from other professionals about the number I gave you. What they're doing and what you're doing is saying the value of trade is X, the cost must be a percentage of X. And that is a methodology, right? And it's sound in relation to the rest of the world where you've got a very clear cost base and where you can do the maths. But what I'm advancing to you is that we did it in a different way, which I explained at some length previously, and then I explained in answer to the Chair's questions. Our estimate is, and it was illustrated by Mr. Clark, our extrapolation of dividing all of the businesses into the 5 groups is that approximately 205 million additional customs declarations will be required for that flow of £382 billion worth of trade, because they are lower value, higher frequency. Now, I know that some people may not agree with that. We've looked at some work which the French tax authority also did, and they've come to the conclusion that you do get between a 3- and 5-fold increase in customs declarations. So our estimate of just under 4 times looks sound in comparison to that. It is based on quite a lot of additional work and research and talking to businesses.
But I'd just say that, I looked at what JML say. They're an international trade organisation. They say customs declarations about 1%. The Porters of Brugge said this morning it's about 1%. The World Bank Doing Business report, this published earlier this year, says it's about 1 to 1.5%. You do seem quite out of line with pretty much everyone else.
You continue to advance a methodology for doing it, and you continue to appear to ignore what I'm suggesting, which is that we did it bottom up on the basis of the number of declarations, which reflects the very nature of the flow of trade. So let me give you a real example. There is a well-known chain of chemists whose distribution centre for the south of England is in northern France. It's not in the United Kingdom, and the nature of distributing those goods, therefore, around that well-known chain is that it crosses over the Dover to Calais on a very, very frequent basis. That is a fundamentally different flow of trade than packaging up a container from South Korea full of electronics and sticking it on a ship for 3 weeks. I mean, the very nature of it is because of the geography. And so I'm trying to say, I understand that the alternative methodology that you're advancing and that which has been advanced by other professionals. Our methodology goes back to the fundamental of what is the flow of trade, how many customs declarations would there be, what's the cost of that, and therefore that's how you get the estimate, which we explained last time and again.
And then I was also looking at the KPMG report that you referenced for the Dutch government. Yep. Table 1 there also shows 1% of costs as well. Why is it that that report doesn't seems to take a 1% figure rather than a 5% figure?
Well, if you've got it in front of you, it shows
I have.
You may have.
Yeah,
it shows a wide range all the way up to 1.9%. Depending
Well, for
on
meat, it's 0.7 to 1.9. For cut flours, 0.8 to 1.3. For paints, 0.4 to 0.6. Communication equipment, 0.4 to 0.7.
If you go into the detail of it, I think it's I can't remember the page. And
it all seems quite low. It doesn't seem to be 5%. Mr.
I haven't brought my copy with me, but I know where it is. In the detail of it, it says that the the cost of completing an export declaration for Dutch businesses is between 32 and 62 euros, an average of 57 euros, and for an import between 40 and 65 euros per declaration, or 50 euros average. So again, it's about an alternative methodology. We think our methodology is sound on the basis of our work, looking at the flows, and is supported by some work done by the French. It's supported by all three of those. But I can understand that people have alternative methodologies which we do not believe is reflective of the very nature of the trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union.
And what about adapting systems so that they'll work most efficiently for trade between the UK and the EU? What has HMRC done about that to make sure, first of all, that systems are ready on day one, secondly, that they're efficient and take into account the way consignments and customs declarations are done to provide maximum efficiency and minimum costs and the most frictionless border?
So you're asking me about the customs declaration service, or in general about the highly streamlined?
End to end.
So in relation to the HMRC's implementation of the customs declaration service, it's been reviewed 15 times. It remains on track. We begin the cut over, the rollout to traders, the migration in August. We've consulted very heavily with the industry about how should we roll that out for traders. So it will be done in three tranches to de-risk it. So some is in August, some is in November, and the final element in December. We're also scaling up the chief system, which is the current system, so that it would be a full contingency if something does not happen to the customs declaration service. So we believe that we're on track to have a fully functioning customs declaration service by January 2019. Which is the fundamental element of this for HMRC. The rest of it then depends on which option you choose.
And finally, many colleagues on this committee are on the Remain end of the spectrum, others on the Brexit end of the spectrum. But I think there's a level of consensus across this committee that the level of preparation for Brexit, wherever you stand, by the Treasury, by the Home Office, has not been what it ought to have been. Do you not think it's incredible that 2 years from the referendum, we still don't know what system we're going to be using?
You'll have to judge it however you want to judge it as politicians. The government is clearly in negotiations. The government's been really clear about what its policies are in relation to customs. It published them openly. There is an ongoing negotiation. When the government's concluded those negotiations, then it will say which option we are to implement, and then we'll implement it.
Thank you. I should say, well, it's almost afternoon. Good morning. I have a supplementary question to the chair. The answer you gave to the chair about the numbers that have been shared across Whitehall. You said the estimates have been in ministerial papers, and there's been an internal validation, Mr. Thompson. I just wondered if you could just elaborate on which ministers, which departments have had sight of those numbers, and around what time frame.
I don't have that information.
Sorry?
I don't have that information.
Okay, would you be able to let us know later?
Well, we need to the details, but
just the names. Which did the Minister for International Trade know about these numbers? DEFRA Secretary, Foreign Secretary. Did it go to a cabinet? it'd just be helpful to know.
So I don't know whether we can or can't give you that information, and I think one of the questions you asked, may have been one of you asked last time, is in relation to this. I know everyone is really focused on what is a customs option, but customs, we are only one department involved in this. So there is the Department of International Trade and DEXU and the Treasury and so on, and there are a range of different options, and depending on which customs option you choose, it has impacts on things like regulatory alignment or freedom, as impacts on trade and free trade agreements and so on and so forth. So there are a wide range of departments. We are not the primary author, therefore, of the papers. So although we have access to those papers, we're not the primary author, nor are we the primary distributor. So I'm not sure that we would be able to answer your question.
Would you be able to tell us which officials in departments have seen the papers? Would that be an easier question for you to answer?
It might be. I think I'll have to think about it.
It'd be helpful to hear from you, if you could come back to us, because it may then be we have to take it up with the Cabinet Secretary. It's just a question of obviously who's seen which.
I asked this question because remarks have been made about your evidence and that it was speculative. So it would be helpful to understand, given what you've said, who's seen it, and why the response and Number 10's response has been, as such. So I look forward to hearing from you at some point. Moving on to cross-governmental working in more depth. A couple of weeks ago, you said, Mr. Thompson, that you believed we could have a functioning border by January 2021, despite the two customs options being proposed by the government taking between at least 3 to 5 years to implement. You said the way to achieve this would be to compromise on one of the government's 3 border objectives: security, revenue, and trade. So, is it fair to describe a course of action that results in the failure of the government's core objective, one of those objectives, as a functioning border, if something has to give? Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I'm just trying to buy myself a few seconds. So I think I also said to you that it might not be optimal.
Yeah.
So there is a difference between it functions and it being optimal.
Yeah.
So it depends on which option comes about and so on and so forth. But we do believe there would be a functioning border in January 2021. Now, if we got to the autumn of 2020 and we could not have a fully optimal border in January 21, then ministers would have to prioritise between those 3 objectives. But that scenario only occurs in the autumn of 2020 if we cannot deliver a fully optimal border. It's worth remembering that the 5 years on NCP is primarily driven by building the tariff reclaim system.
Yep.
You do not need that to operate the border in January 2021.
Yep. Okay. Just if I understand it correctly, so apologies if I haven't. If one of those objectives is sacrificed, we can't compromise on security, can we? We can't compromise on trade, can we?
Sorry, are you?
I'm just asking.
Which question? I was thinking there might be a comma in there.
It will be revenue, won't it? And if it is revenue, that's the least worst thing to compromise on. What might be the cost implications of that, or do you feel it's sort of already covered?
So, look, I don't think we can answer your question. You're asking me 2 hypothetical questions, one built on the back of the second one. So I don't think that we can answer your question. Okay. Ministers would face, if this situation occurs, ministers would face a choice, and they'll make a choice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll ask the ministers.
I would point out that in any customs regime at any point in time, you are always balancing those 3 objectives in any event. I mean, the customs regime today, we don't stop and search every container coming into Felixstowe. You are balancing compliance risk and security and trade fluidity. And what John has said is there is a possibility that on day 1 it will not be at the optimal level that we intend to get it at, and therefore for a transitional period you will have to make some prioritisation choices. But it's inevitable, indefinitely, you will always be balancing those objectives.
Okay, so Ms. Wheeler, on sort of discussions you've had with other departments, can you say a bit more about the kinds of the departments involved? Border agencies, presumably Home Office, the Department of International Trade. Can you reflect on some of their sort of tolerance for slippage on their objectives?
So we have a border planning group which includes 20 departments and agencies who meet regularly to discuss all of these issues. We started out to look at the various commodities, processes and controls that each of those departments has, that it takes responsibility for at the border, and have been working through those very systematically. The areas which have the biggest activity that happens at the border, obviously HMRC, obviously Home Office and the Border Force who police and manage the border, and after that it's DEFRA and FSA. So there are activities in other departments as well, but they are simply less significant compared to those departments. So I think you've heard from HMRC. The Border Force is confident it doesn't. It has security checks and processes, and its security checks and processes are not fundamentally changing as a nature of as we leave the EU. So from that point of view, there is no compromise that we would be expecting associated with any type of slippage that you're suggesting. So that and their activities to prepare are focused on ensuring that all of their border force, they have enough staff and that they are ready and trained and capable to police and manage the borders, and they are confident, we are collectively confident that they will be ready. For DEFRA, they have a large number of products, obviously plants and foods and animals, live animals, pets and fish and equines, and a long list. Yeah. We've been through, and they obviously have been working through exactly how they are planning to manage all of those activities. For a large degree of those activities, they are planning to, or planning assumption that we are working to, is one of a risk-based assumption, i.e. to not be implementing large numbers of extra checks and processes for EU goods, because the risk doesn't change on day one, and as a result of that they are very confident that they will be ready in the light of those scenarios, both certainly for an implementation period. So generally speaking, other departments have I think they're in a good place for being able to deliver at an end of the
and the
implementation
working
period.
across departments is going smoothly, as opposed to silos, which Whitehall has always been critical.
Every organisation has its silos, of course, as you can imagine, but I think actually there's been a very high degree of cooperation and collaboration.
And how does this all sit with this recent revelation of the report about the word Armageddon was used, I think, in the weekend reporting of how trade and exports and imports would operate in the kind of worst case scenario? Has it caused some concern in terms of the way that the workings have now? You will appreciate that the public will be very concerned about reports like that. There's an internal report in Whitehall setting out some of these major concerns, the worst case scenario. How does this group, working across government, think about the way these issues are dealt with and these sort of big issues of anxiety? We've heard a lot about business uncertainty, but consumers, our constituents, are very, very concerned and anxious about the worst case scenario. God forbid it doesn't happen, but if those reports by Whitehall are coming out and people don't know the full picture, how do you deal with those sorts of issues and ensure that Whitehall is providing reassurance as well?
Well, it's not a report I recognise or have seen, and our job is to avoid and mitigate the worst impacts that might be there for any of the scenarios. So obviously we're working across all of the different scenarios for when we might leave the EU and under whatever circumstances. So the two that John has described, but also all of the others exist. Our job is to try to work not only with departments across all of those scenarios, but also with the people who operate the borders, the ports, and indeed that's why we've talked as well to member state colleagues as you've been talking to this morning. So our job is constantly to look at those risks but try to manage them, deal with them and avoid them so that we don't face those issues.
Did Mr Thompson or Mr Harrow want to add to any of this, or if
we
not,
wouldn't recognise those words. Certainly, if there is such a report in some physical form, none of us have ever seen it. I certainly have never seen those words.
Well, maybe it will appear in the committee. Somebody will post a copy to us. If we're lucky. I have one final question, which is about working with local government. Mr Thompson, you mentioned the majority of interventions happened at the local level last year, I think. What's the, in the cross-governmental work, how much attention is being given to the sort of very localised work?
Karen.
Shall I take that? So, in addition to all of our work, as you will understand, the changes that we're trying to do and plan for in government crystallise at a local level, of course, at the port, and many of the different players at the port, at whether Eurotunnel or at the port or at airports. There are many different actors who have to be involved in that, and indeed local authorities have a significant role in there. They often operate the port health authorities who manage the activity associated with the agricultural and food type checks that
that's
happen.
All happening.
And that is all happening, and we've been talking to all the local authorities who represent and support the major ports and airports that we've been talking to, so that we've made clear what our...
Do you anticipate any additional costs to local authorities? I'm asking because local authorities have faced unprecedented cuts over the last 8 years. If Brexit is going to be costly, as we've seen in terms of predictions elsewhere, have you got any thing to say about that?
So our working assumption is that there aren't costs that are naturally going to be transferred onto local authorities. Clearly, there were the different costs in the system associated with this, but one of the biggest areas of work local authorities do associated with border activity is port health activity and controls of food and agriculture. And in the scenario that I've described to you, we don't believe there will be significant extra activity they'll have to pick up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions I want to ask about, sort of perhaps probe a little bit further on a couple of things that we've talked about. I think in view of time, we're probably not going to get on to economic crime today, so we may invite you back. I'm sure you'll be looking forward to that, but it won't be on this dreaded subject of Brexit. But I'm going to bring in Mr. Streeting, so I think you've got a couple of specific questions or something else just at the end. So just going back to actually perhaps finishing where we just did there. Mr. Harrow, I mean, we talked earlier on, I think, about there being no checks needed, I think it was you, Mr. Thompson, on the customs partnership at borders. But presumably you're talking in terms of customs checks, other checks to do with sanitary products or potentially rules of origin or regulatory standards. I appreciate that may not be within HMRC's responsibility, but in the case of the customs partnership, there could still be other checks needed at the borders?
Yes, so from our point of view, when we talk about the new customs partnership, we are talking about customs controls in relation to fiscal matters. So the new customs partnership means that in for UK-EU trade, we would not need any declarations or any movement of goods under customs controls for the purposes of tariff or VAT administration.
And then just building on that, so in relation to the question I asked about VAT earlier on, and I think you said it wasn't a quantum problem but a timing challenge, and you talked about a cash flow impact on business. And I think one of the things that we have discovered was that potentially Royal Mail apply an £8 handling fee on packages. Now that could be that, or I think Mr Clark was talking about agents and others who can help businesses, freight forwarders. Those fees that those sorts of organisations pay could have a cash flow, an additional cash flow impact on businesses who previously haven't had to worry about paying import VAT.
I mean, you are right that parcels move between the UK and the EU at the moment with, in effect, if you're a consumer and you've bought goods from a company in France, they will have accounted for the VAT in France and you will just receive your parcel and there's no customs procedures. In the future, if we apply third country rules, then there would be import VAT due on such parcels, and as things currently stand, you would expect to see the kinds of charges that you've mentioned. However, both at the EU level and internationally, we are looking at how to reform the way that taxation of parcels works, and the EU has already announced that in 2021, which coincides with the end of the proposed implementation period, they propose to move to a new model for parcels where payment of import duties or VAT would be responsibility of the sender rather than of the recipient, and the UK has supported that and is engaging in that. So we are still working on how we can ensure that kind of impact does not arise.
So even despite Brexit, that may be the sort of thing where actually we do want to be following EU rules or working with them, because that could be a benefit to consumers.
It's actually the international direction of travel as well, I think at OECD level too, so I think that there are signs that might all be coming together at the right time.
Okay. And then the other point we touched on 2 weeks ago was about discussions, I think, that you were having in terms of technical discussions with the EU, and actually the difficulty of having, I think, some of those discussions. And we explored this a little bit with the ports and Gatwick earlier on. I just wondered if anything had moved on, if you'd had any further permissions, if you like, from negotiators that those sorts of technical discussions could start.
So we continue to request, and the government agrees with us, that we should have technical discussions with the respective customs and tax authorities, as was suggested with your previous witnesses. We agree with that. But at the minute, the negotiations are with the EU. They're not at individual tax authority level. We continue to request that, and it's part of the ongoing dialogue with the EU.
Thank you. And Common Transit Convention, has there been any? I think again we explored that 2 weeks ago and said that the UK would want to. I think the direction or the government's view is that the UK would want to remain part of the Common Transit Convention. Has there been any progress on that?
So, well, the UK has written to the Secretariat of the Convention applying to re-accede to the Convention when we leave the EU. So that is in train.
So we're waiting for a reply from them, basically?
Yes, and then I would expect to be in negotiation.
And the other issue we touched on 2 weeks ago was about jobs and the number of people that HMRC would need to recruit. So I have to say, then a bit surprised to see that there was a recent Times article just after that saying that HMRC is employing 2,000 fewer staff than on the day of the referendum. So I just wondered if you could talk us through from which parts of HMRC those jobs have been cut, and then as opposed to where you're going to need to recruit to deal with new customs checks and customs issues.
Yeah, the spending review 2015 that my predecessor agreed with the Treasury, the efficient. There was an assumption that in digitising services and providing services with a wide range of digital services, that there would be a reduction in traditional means of contact, i.e. forms, letters and phone calls, and that assumption was, I think I've described it in other places as overly aggressive. Mm-hmm. It assumed that there would be a 70% reduction in contact by traditional means, and in the financial settlement that was reached in 2015, that money was removed from the baseline of HMRC over the 4 years of the spending review. We are seeing, we have had great new digital services. We are seeing reductions in demand, but not at the rate that was assumed. But where people are, as it were, leaving the organisation using customer services, and we are recruiting extra largely in customer compliance. So that's in avoidance and evasion. I think you previously had some evidence, or the subcommittee had some evidence from a couple of our colleagues in that area. But that's where it's the customer services group where the numbers are reducing.
Okay, that's very helpful. Wes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. You'll be aware of the concerns that I raised at this committee with the Chancellor about HMRC's response to French authorities investigating the affairs of Leica Mobile. Yep. In particular, the reference to Leica Mobile being the largest donor to the Conservative Party. I saw your reply to questioning from my colleague Meg Hillier on the Public Accounts Committee. I wonder if you'd just like to firstly outline how it was that donations to the governing party were deemed relevant by an HMRC official or officials when replying to the authorities in France. But secondly, hopefully you've had time by now to look at in depth at what went wrong. You referred in response to Meg that you'd asked the General Counsel in charge of the legal department to look at any systemic lessons. What findings have arisen?
So the review by General Counsel has concluded. We asked her to go through every single one of the requests for mutual assistance from other tax authorities. So there was the Leica Mobile reported one. Forgive me, I don't quite remember exactly how many there are in the course of a year. And maybe in that evidence that you've got before you, but 260 something is the number that I recall. We asked her to go through all of those and to see whether in any of the responses to the others there were any references similar to that on the Leica Mobile. She's concluded that there are not. She's also supported the line I believe I gave to the Public Accounts Committee, which was there is a simple mistake. It's clear that was an error by one of our colleagues who otherwise over 3 pages gave a rather excellent response to the French.
I just wonder, when replying to requests like this, what grade of official would be involved in drafting the reply and who would sign it off?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. But I'll happily provide you with that information if that would somehow...
I think that would be helpful. You just made reference to an otherwise excellent response. I have to say it wasn't just the reference to donations to the Conservative Party that I found troubling, though I think it is deeply embarrassing for HMRC and for the government as a whole. The same correspondence between British and French officials noted that, I'm quoting now, Leica Mobile is a large multinational company with, quote, vast assets at their disposal and would be, quote, extremely unlikely to agree to having their premises searched. Why should the size of Leica Mobile, the assets of Leica Mobile, and the willingness of Leica Mobile to be subjected to search be at all relevant when replying to a request from French authorities?
Well, they're not, and
but why is it in there?
I think I made it clear to the PAC that there are 2 sentences, those 2 that actually, if you've actually got the correspondence between ourselves and the French in front of you, there are those 2 sentences about the donations to the Conservative Party and its respective size are together. Both of those sentences should not have been there.
But it doesn't give a very good impression, does it? Because my reading of that letter was that HMRC quivers in front of multinational companies with vast assets and deems these kinds of, as far as I'm concerned, totally irrelevant factors as relevant when replying to a request from foreign authorities. Did the investigation by your General Counsel look at not just at party political references, but on those other irrelevant factors that were cited in this case?
So look, the response that our colleague gave to the French was an excellent response, which essentially sets out that we can't just do whatever tax organisations, other tax organisations want to do. We have to abide by the law as defined by Parliament. And therefore, what the letter does is to say, thank you very much for your request. The requirements on HMRC are to comply with the law. These are the requirements of the law. There are specific aspects of your request that do not comply with UK law, and therefore we cannot obtain a warrant which you'd like to. Here's how we suggest you could give us the evidence that we could advance the case for you if you'd like us to. That's why it's an excellent response. Our response to large businesses is, I think, extremely good. I mean, we clearly are delivering multi-billion pounds of additional revenue to the government as part of the overall compliance. target, which last year was another record of more than £30 billion.
Well, I'm interested. I mean, I think as the chair indicated, we'll come back to the issue of economic crime at a future session. But
Sure.
but your final part of your answer there is interesting to me, because your 2016-17 annual report has only one mention of money laundering, where it refers to cost recovery. The word crime only appears 5 times. That suggests a seeming lack of focus from HMRC, and in relation to your responsibilities, particularly in supervising money service businesses, which the NRA identifies as higher risk when it comes to anti-money laundering activity. You know, it seems that HMRC is the weak spot in AML supervision, and your reply there about revenue suggests to me that HMRC's focus is largely about simply securing revenues rather than being more concerned broadly about anti-money laundering activity and properly tackling economic crime.
So I have no idea how you got to that conclusion whatsoever. So there are 26 regulators of anti-money laundering, 25 regulators actually in relation to anti-money laundering. You've got one sentence in one letter that I've told you is a mistake in relation to one case. So now you've gone to there was some systemic problem, and I don't understand how your evidence flows one for the other. I will happily answer whatever questions you've got about our anti-money laundering, our role in economic crime, fantastic partnership we have with the NCA and various others and so on and so forth. I'm very happy to do that. In fact, I know that you said you didn't want to ask me any questions. I went back and learned the money laundering, terrorist financing and transfer of funds information on the payer regulations 2017 in anticipation you might ask it.
I promise you that revision will not be for nothing.
I'd really be grateful if you did, but there you go. Look, let's be really, really clear. We are very, very heavily involved in economic crime. We have an excellent record in it. We actually took the trouble this year to produce an annual report specifically in relation to our activities in this area, which went public fairly recently. I'm happy to come back and give you some further evidence about that, and particularly if you'd like, I'll bring the lead officials on that too.
Yeah, I think that would be welcome. My concern, and the reason why I wondered about the systemic culture at HMRC was, as I said, in relation to your annual report, where there was only one mention of money laundering, where, as I said, it referred to cost recovery, and the word crime only appeared 5 times. I know you've got a report on anti-money laundering activity. My concern was whether the appearance of that report as separate from the annual report suggests that this is a bolt-on activity for HMRC rather than core business reflected appropriately in your annual report.
Well, I think that is an interesting question which the executive, if we're being frank about it, the executive committee has looked at all of its activities which are not primarily about raising revenue, and proposes in the spending review of 2019 to have a conversation about to what extent do you actually want HMRC to do. So you picked on anti-money laundering as national minimum wage. Remember, we're still administering tax credits and child benefit and so on. And there's an interesting question about if the primary purpose of HMRC is to collect the revenue that pays for public services, which has fantastic resonance with colleagues. These other activities are undoubtedly important, but are they best aligned with us, or might they be best aligned with someone else? And our plan is to have that conversation in Spending Review 19.
Thank you, and I welcome your candour about that last point. So I think that is an interesting and important debate. On a more positive note, I'm sure we've all received over the years a significant number of emails offering refunds from HMRC on our tax. So only to find, if you're stupid enough to click on the link, that unfortunately HMRC is never proactive in giving money back. And they've been victims of phishing. I did note HMRC's significant success in this area, and sadly I don't get so many emails these days offering tax rebates, but I wonder if you might want to just sort of report to Parliament about your particular work around HMR, around phishing and these phishing expeditions.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do that. So I think we've now managed to strike a world's first, which is we worked with the various internet service providers, so the emails never reach your inbox in the first place. So we work with an organisation called DMARC. And our estimate is with them that we've prevented 500 million malicious HMRC branded emails getting into people's inboxes in the course of the last year. We've also managed to close down 14,000 alleged HMRC websites. We haven't. So we're pushing away at the boundary, because the next big wave is in relation to SMS, which gives you a link back. We're working away at what can we do about that. We've done some innovative work in the UK that's reduced that by 90%, but we need to keep pushing away at this, because the criminals find different ways in which to do it. So I think we've done world first on email, some great work on websites and on SMS, but people should be really, really clear. Unless they actually signed up in their personal tax account to receive emails from us, then we will not email you, and we will not send you an email which has a link in that says click here to get your refund. So never do that. Would be absolutely my advice. I've received them too, which I thought was a fascinating thing. So that, you know, these people are completely indiscriminatory, and people should never click on it. If it, as the Sun, I believe, said recently, if it's too good to be true, then it almost certainly is.
Indeed, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And as I say, we will return to the subject of economic crime, hopefully in a Brexit-free session, but we will thought it was worth exploring the issue of sanctions and borders this morning and customs properly, so we will do that. But for now, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for giving evidence this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.